Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this final session of the Arab Social Protection Compass. I welcome you on behalf of the ILO Regional Office for the Arab States and ISA, the International Social Security Association, and socialprotection.org. Together, these organizations have been working to put together this series on integrated social protection, and we will have several of them, of these colleagues, speaking today during the specific episode. Now, for those of you who might not be very familiar with our series as yet, this initiative, the Arab Social Protection Compass, intends to place a spotlight on reforms and programs geared towards fostering integration within the social protection sector, both across the region and beyond, while seeking to also contribute to stir discussion at national level. Throughout the series, we have been trying to delve into both the theoretical underpinnings and the practical implementation of specific reforms, aiming to inspire a broad audience of practitioners to replicate or scale up similar interventions. In this specific session, which is our 7th and last for this year, we'll be specifically looking at the key findings, the key insights, and the priorities ahead as presented in the ILO World Social Protection Report for 2024-2026, which has been recently published. The report places a special emphasis on the role of social protection in advancing climate action to transition to a more sustainable world of work, with a focus also in the Arab region. The session will explore and interrogate the latest results from the report, discuss the structural factors and drivers that shape the social protection landscape in this region, and propose reflection on outstanding challenges and emerging opportunities. Now, a few housekeeping rules from our end. This session will be recorded, and the recordings will be made available to all those who have registered into socialprotection.org list via email. Closed captions are available, and they're AI generated. Please note that simultaneous interpretation from English to Arabic and vice versa is available, and you can find the specific button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Briefly, you can see now on your screen an outline of our agenda. We will start with opening and welcome. We will then move on to setting the stage, presenting trends and changes that have occurred in the past few years in the region. We will then listen to our panel discussion, and we'll leave finally some time to interact with you, the public, through a Q&A session. Finally, we will leave some time for closing remarks. We would like to remind you to use the chat box to present yourself, make comments, or share useful links. We kindly ask you to utilize the Q&A box and not the chat box for your question to the panelists. And we will be grateful if you can contextualize your question and, if necessary, direct your question to a specific member of the panel to facilitate the process. We also encourage and welcome your interaction with the series by tagging us on social media, utilizing the tags that you see at the bottom of the screen. And now, a few introduction. My name is Marialaura. I will be facilitating the session today on behalf of the ILO Regional Office for the Arab States. Our panelists and intervenants include Mrs. Shahra Razavi, which is the Director of the Social Protection Department at the ILO headquarters in Geneva. Mr. Hashim Zaidi, the Regional Social Protection Specialist at the UNICEF MENA office based in Amman, Jordan. Then we will have Mr. Luca Pellerano, Senior Social Security Specialist for the Arab region for the ILO. Mrs. Ghada Barsoum, a professor and director of Master of Public Policy at the American University in Cairo, Egypt. Mr. Marco Schaefer, the Senior Social Protection Officer and Chief of Social Protection Section at ESCWA in Lebanon. Mr. Ugo Gentilini, the lead economist for the Social Protection and Job Section based for the MENA region at the World Bank. Mrs. Farah Al-Shami, Senior Fellow and Social Protection Program Director for the Arab Reform Initiative, and Mr. Majir Fatallah, Regional Coordinator for the International Social Security Association. We are now, I believe, ready to start with the actual discussion. And at first, I will then hand the floor to Mrs. Shahra Razavi to provide some initial opening remarks to the session. Over to you, Mrs. Razavi.
Thank you very much, Marialaura, and it's a real honor and privilege to be joining you for this 7th session of the Arab Social Protection Compass webinar series, and I'm really pleased to see that the ILO World Social Protection Report is going to be kind of the issues that it raises is going to be the topic of the discussion for advancing climate action and the transition to a more sustainable world of work in the Arab region. So I'll just say a few words. I'm not going to bombard you with too much of the data because I think in the presentation that you will have later, some of this data will be used and you will get a better sense of the exact numbers. But I think the one thing I want to start with is just to say that, you know, it is quite positive that we seem to have passed, despite all the challenges that so many countries and regions are facing, that we do seem to be for the first time having more than half of the world's population having access to at least one social protection benefit, with around 42.4% of the population covered. And this is a positive change compared to what we had, which was almost 10 percentage points less in 2015. But still, despite this progress, we know that something like 3.8 billion people across the world lack any form of social protection, like nothing to fall back on, whether they hit a life cycle contingency like unemployment or sickness, or whether they're, you know, in the midst of a pandemic or a climate-related shock or conflict, as it may be. And when we also look at regions, we also see that there's quite a lot of inequality and diversity. Europe, Central Asia achieves almost about 85% coverage compared to Africa, which is only 20%, and the Arab States region about 30%. So doing slightly better than Africa, but still at the lower levels of coverage. And this is only talking about coverage, and it's not saying whether what benefits people get are adequate or whether there is a comprehensive range of benefits. So it's a real low bar that we are talking about here. We also know that the coverage that people get, you know, varies according to what kind of risk we're talking about. For example, when it comes to pensions, pensions have, in fact, compared to other branches of Social Security, achieved the highest coverage rate. About 80% of people above the national kind of retirement age have access to a pension. Again, it doesn't say anything about the adequacy of it. But when we look at unemployment, it's 1 in 5 unemployed people, 17%, who have access. And even things like, you know, maternity benefits, for example, don't achieve more than 35 percentage coverage. And in fact, we do also see significant gender inequalities in social protection coverage. Although women's coverage rates have increased, we still have a sizable gender-based coverage gap, and this applies across country income groupings. Whether you look at low-income countries or middle-income countries, there's still significant gender gaps. And this is particularly concerning in the context of the climate crisis, which we know has severe impacts on women and girls, which compounds the vulnerabilities that they already face. But the key point, and the highlight of the report is to really say that the climate crisis itself is an inequality multiplier, and it affects, different groups of people differently. And also, I want to also highlight one of the key, I think, data points in the report, something that should really be alerting us all, which is that the 20 most vulnerable countries, vulnerability to climate crisis, those who are at the forefront of the climate crisis, achieve only about 9% of coverage. You compare that to 52.4, which is the global average. So we really do have a lot of urgency in making progress, particularly in those countries, which tend to be low-income countries and small island states. And when you expand that to the 50 most vulnerable countries, you only get 25% coverage, which is still almost half of the global average. So I think this is a real wake-up call. And what we show in the report is that actually having a social protection coverage and social protection benefits has many important kind of advantages in terms of the climate crisis that we're facing, because it increases people's adaptation to climate change, whether it's temperature rises or climate-related disasters and shocks that may happen. But also, it's absolutely a key kind of policy lever to have when countries are putting in place climate mitigation policies, which may displace a number of workers from sectors that are polluting sectors. So having that unemployment benefit and income security to have time to retrain and reskill and be able to move to the sectors where jobs are being created is absolutely becomes key. But also, we know that some of these climate mitigation policies involve removal of fossil fuel subsidies, for example, which can increase prices of basic inputs, of electricity, of energy, and food prices, and so forth, for population, for the general population. And so making sure that these climate mitigation policies are carefully calibrated and ensuring that there is already some social protection coverage in place can really increase people's acceptance of some of these very necessary policies. And we have seen in many countries, from France to Ecuador, the kind of protests that can happen when there is no social protection and governments put these measures of climate mitigation in place, which then have very adverse knock-on effects on people's jobs and food prices, basic necessity prices, and so forth. So preparedness, I think, for climate change, and I'm just stepping out of a conference that we're having here together with WHO on preparedness for pandemics and epidemics. And the same story applies. In order to be prepared, you need to have a social protection system in place ex ante, and not to be in the middle of a crisis trying to improvise and get systems in place and reach people. So that's, I think, the big lesson that we learned from COVID and from, the global financial crisis, all of these shocks that happen and hold suddenly face governments with a surprise. And we've learned the painful lesson that it's much better to have a system already in place so that it can automatically kind of, as it were, kick into action. This means getting the basics right and building systems that provide universal coverage, have that social protection floor. That's the ILO recommendation 202, which has been which was adopted unanimously here in 2012, and that you also provide a comprehensive range of benefits, and that you can use the international labor standards, international social security standards, to build a system that is really providing a solid floor for everyone. And more adequate benefits as countries progressively build their system. And it's very important that there is adequate financing for this. And what I want to really end with, I'm conscious that I don't have much time, but I do want to highlight one of the key findings also that we reflect in the report, a study that we did on the financing gap for having a social protection floor in place. And for lower income countries and middle income countries combined, we know that we need an additional investment of $1.4 trillion per annum to have that sort of floor in place, that social protection floor, which translates into 3.3% of GDP additional expenditure on social protection. We know this is a big, a big number. And particularly when we look at low-income countries, it's even an even bigger ask. So there is a lot to be done, and I want to say that there is now this financing for development discussion that is ongoing. We were just present in New York last week, where the second PrepCom took place. We were a bit disappointed to see that the Elements paper did not include any reference to social protection. We hope that we can all, join forces in making sure that financing for social protection is raised as a really important key investment area that ministries of finance and others need to be paying attention to. And in order to make sure that social protection becomes visible in the zero draft and then moving on to the final outcome document in June, July of next year, in 2025, we have issued a call to action together with USP 2030, which is a big global partnership on universal social protection. And we really hope that others will join our call to action. And the ask in this call to action is to really emphasize the importance of increasing coverage by 2 percentage points per annum at a minimum. And this number, we didn't pull it out of a hat. It's based on what we have seen over the past decade with data that we have. And we think it's achievable. It's ambitious, but it's achievable. And many middle-income countries have done it. So I hope you will join our call. We have only 5 years left until 2030. And given all the crises that we face, different kinds, I think building that social protection floor is an absolute necessity and something that we can hopefully join forces in order to make it happen. So let me stop here and hand over back to you. And thank you very much for your attention and the time.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Razavi, for this very comprehensive presentation over the findings of the World Social Protection Report. I think he has provided us with a lot of food for thoughts, presenting a very mixed picture of risk and opportunities. And I take particular notice of the correlation you have highlighted between countries which are very vulnerable to climate crisis and the very limited coverage, social protection coverage they actually experience. And on the other hand, you actually offers us some glimpse of hope of all the different action and progress that social protection measures, including the floor and the international social security standards, can provide to advance comprehensive climate action. And so thank you very much again for setting the stage. And I now hand the floor to our colleague, Mr. Luca Pellerano, who will briefly present to us some of the key highlights, specifically relevant to the Arab region. So over to you, Luca.
Marialaura, I hope you can hear me, and also that you can all hear me, and also you can see my screen with the presentation that I'm very happy to share with you. It's going to be an attempt at sort of distilling from the World Social Protection Report what can matter for our discussion today, where we take a more specific look at the MENA region. I'm going to go through some of the core findings and also perhaps provide some opportunity to reflect on how these findings can drive the agenda forward in recognizing the challenges, but also the opportunities that the region face in realizing this agenda of universal social protection. Shahra already covered the sort of high-level sort of setting of the report, its ambition to sort of make a connection between the agenda of universal social protection and climate action and just transition. In this session today, we will focus mostly, if you want, on the core of the social protection or social protection report. Its important role in providing a regular monitoring of progress towards SDG, our joint commitment to SDG 1.3. And we expect in a next session of the Arab Social Protection Compass next year to come back to the topic of climate change more specifically. So you'll see that the discussion today will focus mostly on what can we derive from the World Social Protection Report in terms of progress with coverage and expenditure on social protection in the region. The report is available online, and you will find also soon an executive summary is in Arabic is already available, and soon a companion report for the Arab States region is going to be produced, where we will reflect collectively on how the findings of the report apply to the context of the region. And today's conversation is in a way to start that conversation, also leading to the companion report. Shahra mentioned the high-level findings of the report. This important milestone surpassed more than half of the population covered, but also the slow progress. And I want to go quickly on what can we say more specifically about this region. In this slide, you see the first categorization of the region as the Arab States region. As we compare it with other regions in the world, at the ILO, we talk about the Arab states, but it's important to recognize that MENA actually in this picture comes as a combination of Arab states and North Africa, which is subsumed in Africa. So I'd rather suggested we use this as a first sort of snapshot of what the World Social Protection Report tells us in terms of progress towards coverage. As Shahra was saying, there has been progress at very different speed across the world when we look at income groups of countries globally, with high-income countries starting at already a relatively advanced stage and making further progress there. You see the light blue and the dark blue show really the progress that the World Social Protection Report is measuring from 2015 to 2023. And we see also significant progress having been made amongst upper and lower middle income countries who have made important gains towards bringing coverage towards a larger share of the population, but certainly where we see also the coverage gaps gets larger. Only 1 in 3 people in lower middle income countries have access to any form of social protection. And as particular concern for low-income countries, where we actually find only 1 in 10 persons, less than 1 in 10 persons have access to any forms of social protection, and progress has been much smaller than in the rest of the world. So in a way, in places where, in countries where there is more of a larger gap to fill, progress has been smaller. So how does the region compare to this sort of global picture? We're presenting throughout the day today MENA as a combination of 3 sub-regions. As you see in the lower part of this chart, MENA as a whole comprising North Africa, with 6 countries in North Africa. What we call the ILO, the Arab states, are divided in 2 sub-regions, the GCC and the non-GCC, where the GCC comprises countries in the Gulf, and non-GCC are 6 countries, we could say, in the Middle East: Yemen, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, and the occupied Palestinian territories, and Syria. So what can we see from a snapshot at the MENA region? I mean, first, when we compare with world relevant comparators at comparative level of income development, certainly we note that coverage rates are significantly lower than a global average. Most MENA countries are distributed across different income groups. We'll see another chart on that, but it's striking that in the MENA region, a region which is diverse, but also where there are a number of countries with upper and high income status, coverage rate is only around 33%. 1 in 3 persons in MENA have access to any form of social protection. And it's striking also that the progress has been so little. I've witnessed an expansion of programs during COVID, but this doesn't seem to have translated into structural change in the way in which social protection are covering population across different risks, and doesn't seem to have really led to gains which can be comparable to the ones that have been made in other countries in the world at lower and upper income status. So a first call of attention for all of us to sort of reflect, and that's very much the purpose of the meeting today. What is driving this sort of low coverage and also this low pace in making inroads towards coverage increase? If we look at a country breakdown, this slide gives you a sense of country-specific progress. So on the horizontal axis, we map coverage in the old world, the previous World Social Protection Report, and in the vertical axis, we map coverage measured in the last World Social Protection Report. So countries that have moved higher than the sort of diagonal lines have made progress, and countries which have moved below the diagonal line have sort of reversed back. And what's striking to see also in the chart, countries are represented, the size of the bubbles represents population. Of course, larger countries matter more for these regional averages. And what is, I think, two striking findings here: most countries and many large countries are very much on the diagonal line, showing that there hasn't been that great progress, that significant progress during the past 4 to 5 years in terms of gains in effective coverage. A second consideration is that there is certainly great variation in the region, with some countries having made important, let's say, having attained coverage at significant high rate. We see there Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, but also that there is really a diversity of results in terms of coverage, and a group of countries which seems to be really starting from a significantly low base, some of which conflict affected, some of which low income. So while social protection coverage in some way correlates with income status, it doesn't seem to be linear. There are other dimensions, other drivers that explain why certain countries have managed to make gains. We also see some countries that during the period that we have observed have improved social protection coverage somewhat significantly. Morocco is one, Tunisia, Libya, a country I don't know very well, but it would be interesting to discuss more perhaps what drives that positive change. Now, a quick look at the various groups and risks that social protection is about. We've looked so far at coverage across all what we call contingencies, but what do we find when we go down to the level of different groups and risks? The picture is again quite concerning. When we compare to the world, we find that only 23% of children in MENA have access to social protection compared to 28% globally. The coverage of mothers through maternity benefits, here we're capturing both contributory and non-contributory, is strikingly low. Only 9% of women compared to 36% globally. The coverage of persons with disabilities is also particularly low, 17.5% compared to 38.9% globally. And this is one of the cases where we actually see coverage somewhat reversing backwards. So during the period between the past and the current World Social Protection Report, coverage of persons with disabilities seems to have gone in the wrong direction. Slightly better in the case of work injury. Some countries have establish more inclusive systems for work injury compensation, particularly in the Gulf, and that drives Saudi Arabia, case in point, large population, large country, that drives the regional average. Unemployment is another case where the region seems to be significantly falling behind the sort of global average. Only 2% of the unemployed have access to social protection. And finally, old age, as Shahra mentioned, tends to be the contingency, the risk for which social protection system perform better. Yet the coverage is quite low in the MENA region, 46.8, less than half of people in old age have access to any form of social protection, be it a pension, contributory or non-contributory, much less than the global average of around 80%. The final line reflects the coverage of the vulnerable, those who are not covered by contributory system, those who are not sort of under any other life cycle benefits. Only 20% of those are receiving any kind of support. These are typically tax-funded social assistance and other types of programs, compared to 37% globally. So really, there is reason to be concerned as to how the region continues to witness these significant gaps, but also the concern about progress having been across all these dimensions relatively low. We don't have time to go through the breakdown by sub-regions, but suffices to say that sort of this the coverage gaps apply relatively consistently across regions, perhaps with the exception of some of the indicators in Northern Africa, which seems to be more encouraging. And what is striking is certainly that in the Arab states at high level of income status, coverage rates are so low across the board. That has to do largely with issues of migration, as we will see in a second. I put together this chart just before the presentation, so color coding is a little bit different here, but what this chart tells us is a comparison by income status between the world and MENA. And I think it's very insightful. As we have seen across MENA, there are many different income statuses. But what this picture tells us is that certainly for high income countries in the region, all of these are Gulf countries, coverage rates are significant, are about half the global average, the global sort of benchmark, if you want. So there's a huge there's a huge gap to be filled there, and huge structural drivers of that low coverage. Slightly better for lower middle income countries, second from top group. There's mostly it's a mix of countries in the Middle East and North Africa, which actually fares slightly better than the world average. Low income countries, here we're looking at countries such as Sudan, Syria, Yemen, are in a way sharing the same structural challenges that low-income countries globally face when it comes to extending coverage, and also a significant gap for upper middle income countries. Here, the strong driver is fragility. There are a number of upper middle income countries in the MENA who are fragile upper middle income countries, and there we see that the fragility dimension explains significantly, or probably one of the explanations of the gap vis-a-vis the global average. Now, I realize time is short, so from this point of the presentation, we would like to ask ourselves, what can be the drivers of such low coverage? How can we explain the fact that in MENA, across all of these income groups, coverage is so significantly lower than global coverage, even in a context where we know that global coverage is not sufficient to achieve the universal right to social protection? 6 drivers of that can help us explain or navigate, which I'm going to go through as quickly as possible. The first one is expenditure. Not only coverage is low, but expenditure is also low. We don't have time to go into the detail, but you see in this chart expenditure for social protection, contributory and non-contributory in MENA versus the world. And you see that as we compare again with income groupings in the world, which are relevant to the different sub-regions in MENA, coverage, the investment of resources for social protection seems to be falling behind. Certainly for Arab states, for the GCC countries, only 6.6% of GDP compared to 16.2 in high-income countries globally. Certainly for the Arab states, non-GCC, sorry, I mixed up. Arab state GCC 4.2 versus 16.2, so even striking balance. Certainly for Arab states non-GCC, 6.6 versus 8.5 in upper middle income countries, perhaps slightly better again in North Africa. So first driver, low expenditure. It's true that in the region, part of the expenditure is compensated by subsidies, universal subsidies. So certainly a point we can discuss further in the debate. But when it comes to the core of social protection spending, particularly excluding health, so the blue part of the chart, there seems to be drivers of underinvestment in the region. And also in expenditure hasn't increased sufficiently since the last World Social Protection Report. It increased only by 0.1% of GDP in the GCC and North Africa, and it actually declined minus 0.3% GDP in the Middle East, Arab states, non-GCC. Second driver, what I call tilted expenditure composition. Most of expenditure on social protection goes to old age as opposed to people in working age and children. So there tends to be an over domination, if you want, of spending on old age as opposed to spending to respond to risks during working life and also to address needs of children. And in fact, coverage is very much driven by the contributory system. So the contributory system takes the lion's share in terms of the allocation of expenditure and also the stronger contribution to coverage. And a third factor of a driver that can explain low coverage is indeed that those contributory systems are exclusionary in the sense that they don't capture the majority of the labor market within the system. Here we see how MENA regions are, in MENA regions, a much lower proportion of the population contributes to pension system as an indicator of broader contribution to social security as a result of low labor force participation, informality, and unemployment. So systems which are very much geared on contributory, but where labor market are structured in an exclusionary manner, leaving outside many from the capacity to participate in the system. I see Marialaura is on the screen. I'm going to really try to accelerate to wrap up and hand over to you, Marialaura. The fourth driver has to do with gender. You'll see all these details in the World Social Protection Report, but certainly because of the labor market structure, women are at great disadvantage when it comes to accessing social protection in the region. We have a much higher proportion of women who are outside the labor force, but also a much higher proportion of women who, while being in the labor force, do not contribute to social protection contributory systems and do not benefit from tax-funded or contributory systems. So gender, another dimension that explains the, if you want, particularity of the region. The fifth driver is certainly migration. We see across the region big differences in the way in which migrant workers, who represent a very large share of the working population in the region, can participate in a contributory employment-related social protection system. The picture tells you, in a way, the map of the entitlements, the legal entitlements. The darker the picture, the more entitlement and the more comparable the entitlements between national and non-national workers. And you see white pockets in this map, particularly in the GCC, where migrant workers continue to be, with some exceptions, Oman, a case in point, excluded from the system altogether or to a large extent. And finally, the last driver is fragility. I was hinted to that at the beginning. I've highlighted on the map countries in the region that are fragile countries or conflict-affected countries. I want to highlight the fact that the World Social Protection Report only captures spending and coverage of what we call statutory programs, so programs which are run and financed by national institutions. There are, of course, other forms of social protection in fragile settings, humanitarian, externally funded, which are not captured here, but certainly the high number of fragile countries in the region is a reason why coverage has failed to grow as much as we would have wanted. So to wrap up, is there no reason to remain optimistic? I believe it's important that we look into the structural drivers of this, if you want, anemic expansion of social protection, but also that certainly there have been positive signs in the recent years. Not only the adoption of the Ministerial Declaration on the Future of Social Protection in 2021, some very big, ambitious reforms which are taking place, Oman, Morocco, really to rethink social protection as a whole, some important inroads in the rethinking of legal coverage of contributory system to expand to all forms of workers, and also the emergence of new forms of social protection, particularly universal life cycle benefits, such as the new disability benefits in Lebanon, OPT, and Iraq. I also want to mention the increasing attention to social protection as a topic by civil society, the organizations such as ARI, who is in the panel today, really putting more and more focus on this as an important agenda. And the ratifications, which are going slowly, but Iraq, for example, ratified 102. So there are some reasons to have hope. And certainly some of these reforms that are captured in the picture, in the slide here, are not yet reflected in the data. So we also need to be a little bit patient. For example, all the Omani reforms or the Moroccan reforms are not yet translated into numbers which have been captured in the last World Social Protection Report. Perhaps in the next one, things will look slightly different. Where to take it from here, I think maybe I'll leave it for the debate. Here are some ideas as to what priorities can we derive from the World Social Protection Report, but perhaps in the interest of time, let the panel sort of speak to these, and maybe we can come to that in the discussion. Back to you, Marialaura.
Thank you, Luca. Unfortunately, time is not on our side to present such a very complex overview. You shared with us some concerning trends about both coverage and expenditure. And interestingly, you have highlighted the discrepancy between income status of some of the countries in the region and coverage rates, and have identified 6 key drivers. We want to hear now from Professor Barsoum on her views and hear her comments as an expert in the region about these different elements and what might be the rationale for some of these some of these trends. Over to you, Professor Barsoum.
Thank you, Maria. Let me start by congratulating my colleagues on an excellent report, excellent presentation. Thank you so much. You made my task very easy with this very clear presentation. I don't want to talk too much and take time from the panelists. I will maybe say a couple of brief points on the report and on the presentation. So definitely there is progress. But we have to be always aware of the fact that there are billions that are left languishing and unprepared for life cycle adversaries and climate change shocks. It is a daunting prospect. Countries that are most vulnerable to climate change are also extremely ill-prepared for climate change. So the same countries, in the same country, the cheaper land that are the ones that are the most vulnerable areas, and these are taken by the poor. So the poor tend to be in most vulnerable areas to climate change and shocks. I want to jump into my preferred area of research, which is the design issues of social insurance systems, because, Luca has shown that, we always think contributory versus non-contributory schemes. So, and Luca has said, the majority of the coverage comes from contributory schemes, but contributory schemes are notoriously exclusionary in the Middle East and North Africa region. And I would like to focus on issues of system design, because we know that social insurance systems tend to be very costly in this region. It reaches almost 1/3 of the insurable income in some systems. Most countries follow a minimum bound and a maximum bound, which, when the minimum bound is high, the system becomes extremely regressive, because those in a lower income bracket tend to pay much higher percentage of their incomes to contributions to the social insurance system, which tend to push those at the lower skill base, those lower productivity workers out of the social insurance system, despite all the good intentions of policymakers in system design. There is also the administrative burden of social insurance. Our recent work has focused on this. It is difficult if you want to join a social insurance system in some of the countries in the region to join if you don't have the proper documentation, and if you are not in a formal enterprise, or either as an entrepreneur or as a wage worker. So I want to highlight this as one of the key challenges in the region, that social insurance tend to be high because of inflationary pressures on the system. The costs tend to be high, and the administrative burden tends to be high. And to me, this is a major burden and a major challenge for expanding access to social insurance and social protection. When we take a life cycle approach, we realize that, and the report shows that social protection continues to be elusive for the children. The report shows that 1.8 billion children are out of the realm of social protection globally. Also, people in the working age are also out of protection. People in working age are actually in a very very difficult situation because of the two challenges of the design of social insurance and contributory systems, but also social assistance and non-contributory systems, which tend to be residualist. They tend to be category focused. So, for instance, programs would focus on the widows, on orphans, on people with disabilities, but would not have a universalistic approach to people in need, and does not take a life cycle approach. So usually people in the working age population are usually mostly out of the realm of social assistance, and those who cannot afford to join social insurance are also excluded by this. And this brings to the fore again issues of design and targeting for non-contributory schemes, and so when many countries implement means testing approaches, these systems tend to be residualist. So they manage to reach, if they're targeted well, if they're well designed, they manage to reach the poorest of the poor, but leave the majority of the poor out of the realm of social protection. And also these, although we talk about universality in different contexts, but the problem is once you talk about universality, you find policymakers extremely nervous. And this is specifically the case in countries that are reliant on a cash economy because of the unregistered income, because they see that universal coverage would mean that some of the privileged groups would not be paying their taxes for whatever they get. I will conclude with the barriers to healthcare access, which is a very important aspect and a short-term benefit of social insurance. And it's quite salient and well documented because of the out-of-pocket health expenditure documented in the region by households, and of course issues of physical distance, limitations in the range and quality of healthcare service. I am very happy that Luca talked about the barriers, because I want to conclude with this. I think the elephant in the room would always remain expenditure. Protection gaps are largely associated with significant underinvestment in social protection, and a meaningful conversation about expanding access to social protection should start with a conversation about how much is being spent into these programs out of national GDPs. And then we can focus on how these programs are designed, whether the category focused approach, the specific groups that are targeted in certain systems, specifically social assistance systems, how they're more focused on old age. And again, with that, you'll see some of them covered actually by contributory systems, and leaving children aside, leaving people in the working age population who are facing some income shocks uncovered. And again, the final point is gender. Women tend to be out of the labor force in this region. This morning, I was in another session talking about gender, and I keep saying women's employment is not a women's only issue. It is at the heart of social protection, because it leaves half of the population away from access to social protection. In countries in the MENA region, we have a very unusual situation, women tend to be out of the labor force. When they join the labor force, specifically among the educated, they tend to be in better jobs, but there are just very few of them in this situation, but the majority are out of the labor force. I want to conclude by thanking you for an excellent piece, and thank you for inviting me to this session.
Many thanks to you, Mrs. Barsoum, for this excellent overview. We thank you for shedding a light on, again, some additional elements, such as the relevance of design feature in excluding or including vulnerable population and social protection system, as well as emphasizing again the importance of underinvestment in social protection and determining like these results, these trends that we have seen in Luca's presentation just earlier. So thank you again also for keeping very well to the time. We now open the panel discussion with our colleagues. And we will start with Farah, our colleague and friend from the Arab Reform Initiative. Welcome again, Farah. So a first question for you. So we have seen through the presentation and now again through Professor Barsoum comments, a very limited increase in social protection coverage between 2015 and 2023, moving only from 28 to 30% of the population covered. This is unfortunately one of the slowest progress rates in the world. What are, in your view, as Arab Reform Initiative, some of the main factors which explain this limited progress? And again, what should be our focus moving forward on what should be the measure we should move forward to ensure that we switch gears and we expand coverage as fast as possible? Over to you, Farah.
Thank you very much, Marialaura, and thank you to the ILO, to Luca for the invitation. I am pleased to be among you today, and congrats to the ILO on this very important and timely and useful report. Very well done. In response to your question, Marialaura, so historically, social protection in the Arab region was used as a tool for political bargains and for authoritarian bargains. And of course, to offset political system deficits and to ensure political compliance. This was historically possible because of oil and gas exports, because of strategic channels like the Suez Canal, like remittances from foreign workers, politically driven aid. All of these were really generating revenues that were making this model possible. But over time, revenues from these sources started to decline, and governments started to have, to Arab governments, and especially non-GCC governments, they started to have to prioritize spending on specific social groups. Now, to begin with, they had then to prioritize this spending for upper middle and high income classes, because this is the social class that serves the intertwining between the business and the political elite, and that serves the crony capitalistic outsourcing that is to the favor of Arab regimes. Now, in the 1970s to 1980s, with the economic and financial crises and the consequent public discontent, bread riots, mass protest movements, etc., governments needed to survive. They needed to stay in power, and therefore to uphold their sectarian, their clientelistic, and their nepotistic systems. So they resorted, they have also this power sharing system that they survive on. And this power sharing system or model helped them use social protection as a tool to basically regulate demographic and sectarian balances, to basically maintain their governance and political economic models, and to achieve political and economic gains. Now, this era basically coincided with the rise of neoliberalism then, and when basically Bretton Woods institutions, international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank were also emerging then. And this happened while the government, as I was saying, was in the lookout for alternative sources of financing, because they didn't have the revenues that they used to rely on. So they were looking, governments at the same time, for alternative sources to finance social protection, and they had no choice but to resort or to turn to the Bretton Woods institutions for this, to basically count on foreign aid from these institutions to be able to finance social protection. And the Bretton Woods institutions' approach to social welfare policies is a poverty alleviation approach. It has always been like this because in the bigger scheme of things, their approach is a neoliberal approach. So they adopt a poverty targeting approach that is basically that replaces a rights-based approach instead of it being any rights-based. And this happens to be compatible with the government's interests and what the governments were finding basically useful to them. So this is basically what led to the current status quo. And of course, I will focus in my intervention on one of the challenges, which I think is like a key or a main challenge to focus on. So this is basically what led to the current status quo of the social protection landscape in the region, which is basically fragmented, but also predominated by targeted assistance, although it is error prone, given the targeting methods and the algorithms that are being used, such as proxy means testing and mixed means testing and others, and that are in large part exclusionary. And it's also predominated, in addition to targeted assistance, by active labor market programs and humanitarian aid. Speaking now about social security schemes, universal schemes, these are shy, and these are mainly contributory. So if they exist, we mainly find contributory schemes of the sort, which are and also employment-based, that are mainly employment-based. Now, starting from this point, the barriers to contributory schemes in the Arab region are real. So we have, for example, for different reasons. First of all, we have an insufficient political will on the part of the governments. We have issues of institutional capacity and fragmentation, and we have a lack of public trust in public systems and state systems of all kinds. And all of this is basically reducing the uptake and shrinking the contribution base, which is making contributory schemes, if they exist, unsustainable. In addition to many other factors, Dr. Barsoum mentioned some of them. The aging population is also one of the factors. Speaking now about the non-contributory part, about the tax-financed part, we are also in the region suffering from a small tax base, a very small tax base, and that is due to the large size of the informal sector, as this is shown. The exclusion of migrants and refugees, tax evasion, tax avoidance, unnecessary tax exemptions, deductions, and credits, and tax incentives, especially speaking here about corporatism and tax dodging. And at the same time, there are issues of self-exclusion due, again, here in the tax base, like in the contributory base, due to the lack of trust in the public system and the broken, basically, social contracts. So for the people, they think of it this way: no rights, it means no taxation, no representation, no taxation. For the government, at the same time, in large part, it is like you don't want to pay taxes, no taxation, no services. They don't even want to collect taxes so that they are not, they don't get forced to provide services, including social protection in return. Adding to all that, issues of corruption, misappropriation and embezzlement, illicit financial flows, public finance issues such as tax administration, issues of tax collection, and very structural public budget deficits and fiscal imbalances that we are having. Adding to that,
Farah,
yeah, excuse me.
I'm sorry, I will have to ask you to wrap up, sorry.
Yeah, I think I need 1 to 2 more minutes to be able to basically provide a coherent take as I have prepared it. So adding to that, the international financial institutions, again, which are playing their part, because through this global financial architecture, Arab countries are being victims to chronic indebtedness, to debt, to austerity as a main form of conditionality by international financial institutions, and to bad credit risk management, such as very high surcharges that our borrowing governments need to pay. So this is really shrinking or reducing the fiscal space that is available for social spending. If we are to speak about austerity, IFIs are always promoting the decrease or rationalization of public expenditures, cuts or caps in the public wage bill, reducing subsidies, and you see the IMF and the World Bank coordinating with each other, with the IMF promoting reduction in subsidies so that the World Bank can, so that we increase cash transfers instead. And basically, we're using the cash transfers to offset the impact of austerity more broadly. And regressive taxation of all sorts, like our the tax reforms that are being promoted by international financial institutions are predominated by VAT and many other forms of regressive taxes, whereas progressive taxes of all kinds are very also anemic. In addition to that, international financial institutions in many contexts are privatizing pension systems and social insurance systems, reducing employers' contributions, and imposing labor market flexibilization and deregulation policies, which is further exacerbating the informalization, basically, and in addition to many other financial and trade liberalization. Now, to wrap up with the last sentence, all of this is indeed shrinking the fiscal space available for social spending, social protection spending, and health spending, available for public spending in general. But this kind of spending, social spending, is being most impacted given our government's priorities. And if you look at the data, you would see that in many contexts and at many points in time, military spending outperforms social spending, or that debt servicing, such as interest rate payments, for example, also outperform social spending. So this is to say that it is the financing that I think is one of the key challenges, and that the global financial architecture is making this worse. Adding to that, the political economy that our governments operate on, and of course, issues of institutional capacity, but also of gaps between the legal levels, the legislative levels, and the executive and implementation levels. If we are to think of alternatives, okay, I can stop here. I just wanted to say that if we are to think of alternatives, it goes without saying, we need to think of tax reforms that are progressive, to introduce contributory schemes gradually while building trust in public systems, to think of debt restructuring, of grant-based climate finance, and of solidarity financing of all sorts, including global solidarity mechanisms and other fiscal space strategies. Thank you, Marialaura. I'm very sorry for taking more time.
Thank you. Thank you, Farah. And there might be other opportunities towards the end to elaborate more on some of those concepts, but we need to move on to give enough space to all our colleagues. I hand over now to Marco. A question for you, Marco. So the trends that Luca and Mrs. Razavi have presented are obviously regional averages, as we know. But based on your vantage point of observation at ESCWA, what do you read in terms of sub-regional trends and differences? Can you identify some specific outliers that have shown significant commitment actually to the realization of social protection reform? And on the other hand, others that might have suffered particularly from a stall in progress? From both of them, we definitely can gather useful lessons. Over to you, Marco.
Thank you so much, Marialaura, and thank you also for having me, and congratulations also to the ILO for publishing this important report. It's really, really helpful to have new figures to look into, okay, what has changed and what can we do about it. So that's really helpful. Now, let me get back to this original observation that the progress in the Arab region has been relatively modest. And I think it depends a little bit on what kind of metrics you used. And from an ESCWA perspective, we have a little bit of a different way to look on the Arab region in terms of the countries that belong to that. So we follow more or less the League of Arab States classification, which is 22 countries that also include countries like Somalia, Djibouti, Comoros, and Mauritania. And my colleague Anton Björk a while ago published, or a couple of weeks ago, published a blog on the more recent data on coverage, SDG 1.3 coverage, and how do those compare to the earlier report. So, and we calculated the weighted average at that time of 28% across the Arab region, across the 22 countries. Now, the more recent data from the recent report show 34.7%. So that's an increase of 6.5%. So it's a jump of, let's say, 1 quarter from the perspective of 2020 in terms of the weighted average. So yes, you could say that the glass is half empty, since the gap between the global average and the regional average, it's quite substantive indeed. However, you could also say with some justification that the pace of change, despite all the conflicts and crises and shocks in the region, has actually been quite substantial and potentially outpacing other world regions. And therefore, the glass could also be actually viewed as half full. And Shahra mentioned this, let's say, aspired increase of 2% per annum. And I think if we take this as a benchmark, and if we refer to the 6.5% over 3 years, I think the Arab region, with of course all kinds of, let's say, unevenness, is more or less within those bounds. But indeed, the unevenness matters quite a lot. So let me get to the regional or sub-regional trends, and I'd like to answer this question slightly different and a bit more along the lines of what Luca already mentioned in terms of high-income countries, upper middle-income countries, low middle-income countries, and low-income countries. So if we take this vantage point, there's a quite interesting pattern, and Luca alluded to this a bit earlier, but on the way we look at the region in terms of its averages is a little bit, seems to produce a little bit different outcomes. So one pattern that's quite interesting is that we see relatively low coverage figures in the Arab region's high-income countries, much lower than non-Arab high-income countries, and at the same time also much lower at times, at least vis-a-vis the Arab region's upper middle-income and lower middle-income countries. And it's particularly interesting to see that the two of the very high-income countries in the region, Qatar and United Arab Emirates, report surprisingly low coverage rates across most of the social protection functions. And it has been mentioned that this might be due to the large share of migrant workers in some of the countries. And I'm actually, or we are actually not quite sure, because this effect, that's what we see, is a pattern that cuts across multiple social protection functions, not just those that are relevant for migrant workers. So this pattern that the region's upper middle-income countries, and at times even the lower middle-income countries, outperform the region's high-income countries appears to be relatively consistent across social protection functions. It relates to children covered by social protection benefits. It relates to work injury coverage, persons with disabilities receiving benefits, older persons receiving benefits, and workers contributing to pension schemes. So it's interesting, or it might be interesting to look really how those two high-income countries report on their coverage. Now let me briefly touch upon the outliers at the country level vis-a-vis the earlier report of 2020. And I think we can see two types of outliers, those upward jumps in coverage, but also surprising downward trends. However, it's not always clear whether these steep changes reflect actual changes or rather hint at reporting issues. For example, Somalia in 2020 reported 16% coverage, while in this year's report it's 0%. So unless Somalia's Pellerano program, which is an unconditional cash transfer program, has ceased to operate, I would think that it makes sense to look into how is it reported actually that we get to this 0 figure. Now let me briefly mention also a few interesting upward jumps, and Morocco has already been mentioned. Jumped from 20.5% in 2019 to 42.5% in 2023. And that's likely related to a massive increase in the number of children covered by child and family benefits, jumping from 13.4% in 2019 to 74.2% in 23. Now Bahrain jumped by 1/3 from 62.4% to 82.4%. Here, coverage increased potentially through various benefits that have appeared to have further improved since the previous report. Now, Libya has been mentioned. It jumped from 46.2% to 66.1%. We don't actually really know what's behind it. It's possibly high coverage of child benefits. It has been reported to be 55.3%. And the country reports 100% of coverage of poor persons. However, we do not really have earlier figures, so that's difficult. So what I'm trying to say is it's not always straightforward to interpret these steep changes in one direction or the other. It seems, however, that those reported steeper changes between reporting periods are, at least in tendency, more often related to the expansion of or to the introduction of social assistance programs, and less in tendency, at least in relation to membership increases or decreases in social insurance.
Thank
which
you, Marco.
seems to have stalled. Yeah. So I think
I
what
need
I'm
to
trying
ask
to
you
say,
to wrap up.
I think what's important is to look into this social insurance. Why is it stalling, and what can be done about it? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco. Sorry to cut you slightly short. We are running slightly behind schedule. So I'll move over to Ugo now with our third question. So Ugo, as we have briefly discussed, closely related to the limited progress in social protection coverage rate in the region is obviously the limited public investment in it, which remains among the lowest globally, again, 4.6% compared to 12.9% globally. In your view, what are the key bottlenecks which have hindered so far increase of public expenditure in the social protection sector, and to which extent, from your perspective as a social protection leader at the World Bank, can international organization and international financial institution influence these improvements in terms of earmarked public budget allocation and expenditure?
Thank you, Marialaura. Thank you, the ILO team, for inviting me. Greetings from Washington, where the sun is rising as I speak. I think that my answer kind of reflects also what others, Luca, Marco, have been underscoring, which is that when you look at country-level data, MENA is highly heterogeneous, also on the spending side. Some countries spend less than their peers, a group of fragile states and some of the high-income country Gulf states. But then there are a group of countries, particularly some of the upper middle-income countries like Algeria and Iraq, where spending is not too far off from global peers. And actually, some middle-income countries, Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia, Morocco, actually spend between 60 and 120% more than their peers. So these kind of different contexts present different priorities and kind of pathways for improvement. And this heterogeneity is also reflected on the revenue front. So we have kind of resource-rich countries, including those with high hydrocarbon exports that display high reliance on non-tax revenues, which account for about 70% of their total revenues. And conversely, you have a range in the rest of the region where the share of non-resource revenues is over 75% of total revenues. And these countries have kind of a more diversified mix of revenues across different taxes. And if we combine the spending and revenue considerations, what are the next effects on welfare? And here there is emerging fiscal incidence analysis that actually reveals that in about a dozen countries, if you take a dozen countries for which data is available, in 1/3 fiscal systems are poverty reducing, in another third they are kind of poverty neutral, and in another third, actually the combined effects of revenues and spending are increasing poverty. So really some important reforms are needed here. And I think that there is an emerging kind of three-pronged fiscal agenda to make fiscal systems more social protection sensitive. And I would think of kind of the first bucket of issues includes expanding the revenue frontier and balancing the revenue mix. The tax to GDP ratios in resource-rich countries are among the lowest globally, typically around 5%. And this injects rigidity in fiscal systems, which tend to be pro-cyclical and tied to international price volatility. And in this context, a premier challenge is pivoting towards greater fiscal diversification, less reliance on hydrocarbon revenues to ensure more flexibility in counter-cyclical spending. And this diversification is beginning to happen. There has been the introduction of, in some cases, of VAT in some Gulf states, and actually some corporate income tax as well. And meanwhile, in non-resource-rich middle-income countries, they exhibit higher tax to GDP ratios, typically between 15 and 25%. These contexts, as I said, have a more mixed composition, personal income tax, corporate income tax, indirect taxation, but face, as Luca said, some formidable challenges in terms of informality, as well as labor markets and tax administration, collection, and compliance. Then if we look at the second bucket of issues, I think there is a big agenda on spending better what resources already exist. So on one hand, more resources are needed. On the other hand, we can spend better what exists. I think the subsidy reform process, I think there are a lot of lessons from the past. I'm happy to discuss more if I have time, which I don't think so, but there is probably a new way of thinking about how to do them in a way that is more politically, economically sustainable. There is a big agenda on preparedness and anticipatory action, and here I would also include the integration of social assistance and parts of social insurance, including for a range of contingencies like life, health, injuries, unemployment, and other kind of short-term risks. Luca mentioned the contributory system, so there is also an agenda for more sustainable pension systems, and also perhaps how a judicious use of technology could help deliver more cost-effective programs. And then thirdly, so you have more revenues, you have better. I will have to ask you to
wrap up.
Yeah, I'll do that in 30 seconds. I think there is a multiplicity of, there is not just a state in MENA. There are so many other providers and all doing kind of similar social protection interventions. External assistance, there is about 33 billion in development and humanitarian assistance, and only 2% of that, of ODA, goes to social protection. And virtually none of the humanitarian aid, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes less so, is channeled by recipient governments, and only about 40% of development assistance is so. There are sovereign wealth funds. There are about 28 of them in MENA, managing about $5 trillion. A small but an interesting part of them is actually engaged in social protection type interventions. And finally, we never talk of zakat. And there is a wealth of quasi-formal institutions that are actually engaged in revenue collection, some mandatory, some voluntary, on spending, on delivery systems down to community level. And we have to think, I think that's part of this third bucket on how it all comes together. Assistance by the state, private sector, informal assistance, all under a coherent framework. Thank you, Marialaura.
Thank you, Hugo, for this very comprehensive answer. I will now move to Majid. Majid, so we will discuss with you about labor force data, which are presented in the report and that show significant variation in social insurance coverage across countries, suggesting that national extension policies do in fact make a difference. In your understanding and experience of the region at ESA, Is there any specific recipe that has proven to be effective in promoting extension of coverage to those in new and non-standard forms of employment and progress in formalization? I will be very grateful if you can keep your answer quite concise, Majid. Thank you. Over to you.
I'll try my best.
Thank you, Marialaura. Thank you, everyone. I will answer on my behalf, on the behalf of ESA and all those who are implementing different reforms. So we have been able to contribute with our own experience, and we have benefited a lot from the entire series of initiatives that we have organized with ILO. So to answer your question, I can tell you that there is not only one recipe, if I could say so. In fact, there are different circumstances and conditions that we need to take into account. However, we can notice that there is a general trend towards a more comprehensive method. So it is not only about one policy, one initiative, one mechanism that can work. So whenever we have this integral structure, we will be able to grant protection to more people. We need to improve the contributory system, and we need contributions to be well examined, if I could say so. We have noticed as well that we have implemented many reforms in Morocco. The aim was to have a more comprehensive system to extend different pensions and different allowances to everyone. The aim was to expand family benefits, universal pensions, and the aim was to help everyone, the workers, including the self-employed, to enable them to afford the contributions, knowing that these should be able to work in the formalized sector. One more thing, recently we have organized in Tunisia a workshop in order to handle the question of different entrepreneurs, those who are self-employed, those who are freelancers. We have went through different experiences from Morocco, from Algeria and Tunisia in order to extend social coverage to those self-employed entrepreneurs. And we have stressed, based on ESA's, of course, initiative on the following. Contributions should be affordable for the target groups and should not be intended to provide additional funds to the social security system, but rather to empower these groups and help them develop their activities and projects. We talked about simplifying procedures, shortening deadlines, and using modern means of payment. We talked about providing diverse, adequate, flexible, and feasible social protection programs and services so that they can be attractive and motivating. And we talked about complementing these programs with a package of incentives, including training, coaching, easy access to bank loans, marketing assistance, among others. One of the most interesting experiences that we have presented during the seminar was the new integrated system recently introduced in Tunisia, mainly for the workers, the female workers in agriculture and rural artisans. This program, which is partially funded by the state, provides health and old age insurance coverage and is based on a unified collection mechanism that includes social security contributions and income tax together. This is what brought the system to the workers and not the other way around. In addition to the aforementioned general incentives, initiatives such as training, coaching, access to bank loans, and marketing of goods, this program provides rural women workers with decent and free as well a way of living. There is another thing that we need to stress on. It is very important as well to be able to reach everyone. In fact, more and more countries have been trying to understand in a better way those who work in the informal sector. And we can give here the example of Jordan. We know how the legal structure there, the structure is based on contributions. However, this wasn't always reflected. In fact, the Jordanian Social Security, with the support of ILO and through programs such as Sustainability Plus Plus, also the Social Security has invested in diagnostic exercises And as a result, it has gained a more nuanced understanding of the barriers and how to best address them from a policy and administrative perspective. So this is what I wanted to say briefly in order to answer your first question. The floor is yours, Marialaura.
Thank you so much, Majid, also for keeping to time, which is very helpful. We now start our second round of questions, which will be quite fast. We go back now to Marco, talking about the situation of the missing middle. So missing middles are those workers often in informal employment who are neither covered by contributory mechanism nor by non-contributory one. So they are very vulnerable to fall through the cracks of any social protection mechanism. Arab states are reported to invest only 1.4% in social protection for people of working age, compared to 4.8% globally. How would you explain, Marco, this situation and what can be done about it? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Marialaura. And it's, of course, a very essential question, specifically for the middle-income countries in the region. However, let me add a little bit of a nuance to the figures. Indeed, the reported spending figures are relatively low, and there's no denying about that. However, again, I think we see a pattern that is mentioned earlier. The region's upper middle-income countries and the lower middle-income countries report higher spending for this group than the region's high-income countries. And some of the region's lower middle-income countries actually spend 0.6% more as compared to the world average. So I think that's important to note. It's not that clear cut across the region. I think that's important to understand in the first place. Now, also, I think we need to look a little bit forward, or we need to look a bit into what's currently happening in the region, and some of that has been already mentioned. For instance, there has been recent legislative and budgetary changes in Tunisia and Morocco, possibly also changes coming up in Iraq and Egypt. And I'd assume that we'll again look at slight improvement of these spending figures for the region's upper and lower middle income countries in a few years from now, assuming that, of course, that by then the legal coverage has to some extent translated into actual coverage for this important population group. Now, what can be done about it? And I guess, indeed, there's lots that ministries of social affairs or ministries of labor can do to address this shortcoming, specifically in terms of increasing coverage against life cycle risks of those who are neither covered by social insurance nor by social assistance, meaning the missing middle. And I think it starts by addressing some of the key barriers that have already been mentioned. For instance, reducing the administrative burden of joining such social insurance schemes by simplifying procedures, possibly establishing flat rates or flat amount contributions for some groups that cover social insurance contributions and tax payments where required, and importantly, subsidize contributions to such schemes, at least for those groups with very little contributory capacity. And I think that's indeed what we see a little bit across the region, at least in some of the North African countries. For instance, Morocco and Tunisia introduced legislation to that effect. It's basically flat rate amounts, simplified schemes for so-called auto entrepreneurs, self-employed, that have been enshrined into law in recent years. And I think we're going to see some coverage changes for this group in the years to come. Now, maybe it's more important also to discuss a bit challenges that governments and specifically ministries of social affairs in middle-income countries face in establishing schemes to this group. Because we see, I guess, a competition a little bit in terms of budget and in terms of membership between the non-contributory and the contributory side, in terms of, okay, where do we allocate budget? And so far, the poverty-targeted programs have seen a better track record in expanding coverage. And the question is, to what extent can this be diversified going forward? Related to this is also the question of disincentives created by some of the eligibility criteria for poverty-targeted programs, where at least some of those that could be eligible for social insurance or could be attracted to simply choose to go to the other side or being selected to that side. However, I think it misses a little bit the bigger picture, I think, because the challenge goes much beyond what individual social ministries of social affairs can do, because interestingly, or worrisomely, I think the economic development, the labor force development in the region is very particular, and it's a little bit different from other regions. We see relatively decent GDP growth rates, sometimes ranging between 2 and 6% in Egypt in recent years. But interestingly, it doesn't really translate into the creation or development of private sector driven formal socially insured employment. And there's a bit of a decoupling between economic growth and employment creation that leads to socially insured coverage. And I think going forward, ministries of social affairs, ministries of labor, ministries of planning and economy need to one way or the other join forces to make sure that growth is not happening in sectors that are somehow insulated from job creation, from formal job creation, but happens in those sectors where there is maybe some elasticity in creating employment. I think that's the challenge going forward in a number of middle income countries. And
Thank you.
I guess I stop here.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. Thank you. I see that several of the questions that the audience has been writing to us are being answered in writing. So I refer colleagues, whoever is listening and watching, like to look at the Q&A box. We will have to move very fast. Unfortunately, we are behind schedule. So very quick questions to our panelists. Now I'll go back to you, Hugo. We have seen that the pervasive state of fragility and conflict faced by many countries in the region has impacted and continues to impact on the limited rate of progress. What good practices on aligning the humanitarian response with national social protection systems building can you highlight from across the region? And is there, in your opinion, Hugo, sufficient commitment to the HDP Nexus agenda in the MENA region? Over.
So, Marialaura, this is obviously a very compelling question, and I think there is really an emerging and very rich literature and a range of case studies out there that have been documented. So I thought perhaps to use this couple of minutes instead to reflect on some of the developments in the World Bank that perhaps are sometimes less known out there. And you know, the bank is becoming more agile in fragile states. If you look at some of the metrics, project preparation in those contexts under the environmental and social framework is almost half in terms of time than under kind of safeguard policies in other contexts. The median procurement time for processes in fragile states recently decreased by 30%. And over the past 5 years or so, the bank staff working on fragile contexts grew by almost 60%. And also kind of, you look at the share of ratings from implementation completion reports are roughly equivalent in fragile states to those in non-fragile states. So there's been quite an improvement. And there is always this tension or balancing act between working in conflict and working on conflict. So in conflict with all the kind of do not harm principles versus working on conflict and trying to tackle really the drivers of fragility. And if you look at some of the developments internally, the institutional incentives have in many cases been devised to pivot towards on-conflict approaches. And for example, you know, a key requirement for accessing the prevention or resilience allocation or the turnaround allocation is for countries to recalibrate their portfolio to try addressing those root causes. And also, kind of, we're building a track record of remaining engaged during conflict and crisis. It's not only MENA, but you look also at other engagements like Ukraine. There have been new ways of looking at needs assessments during war with the UN and the EU, for example. keeping the financing for essential government services active. There is a new generation of IBRD framework projects that is on the rise, and this basically includes scalable projects with modular implementation, basically identifying a coherent program with clear outcome to facilitate donor coordination. And of course, third-party implementation is crucial and remains a big part of the portfolio. Direct financing to the UN includes about 83% of the 4.3 billion worth of partnerships with the UN over the past 8 years. And some of the financing innovations, like the remaining engaged during conflict allocation, we know builds on the experience of Yemen under IDA 18 and was introduced to IDA 19 as part of the FCV envelope. And there is also really a data revolution in those contexts, a wider use of satellite imagery, social media analytics, drones, ground sensors, anonymized cell phone data tracking, night lights, active fire data. All of this is really augmenting, I think, the toolkit to work in those difficult cases. And you asked for an example, and just in 20 seconds, let me talk of Yemen for a second. And there are two aspects that really stand out on how the bank has been working with partners in the country. And one is that if you look at the past 10 years or so, there has been this large unconditional cash transfer program just by sheer coverage. It used to cover, and still today, about 30% of the population. That makes a program in Yemen in the top 10 in terms of coverage globally. I mean, it's one of the highest coverage programs globally in Yemen, including continuing to operate under difficult circumstances. And this was possible because of a partnership with UNICEF particularly, but also because of the involvement of institutions like the Social Development Fund.
Thank you, Hugo.
That is, yes, and I think that the model also shows that involving public institutions from the get-go can also offer hope for when conditions allow, also for taking the program back where it started, which was as part of national social protection systems in the country, including in a very high fragile state like Yemen. Over to you.
Thank you, Hugo. Sorry to cut you short. Colleagues, we are almost at the end. I will have a very quick question for Farah, because it's important that we talk about the differential rates of effective coverage between men and women in the Arab states. Farah, over to you. If you can highlight in 2 minutes, literally 2 minutes, what is one concrete way that you think integrated social protection can make a difference in overcoming this long-standing challenge? And then we'll move over to Ashim for closing remarks. Thank you.
Thanks again, Marialaura. I'll try to make it up for you this time with a shorter intervention. So I think that it is expected first for women to be naturally more impacted because they are on average more vulnerable, and thus they are more susceptible to shocks and to the loss of income and livelihoods. So that is expected. And this is because, why is it expected? Because of explicit discrimination against them, especially in the Arab region. When I say explicit discrimination, it means in the laws like social security law, inheritance labor law, and of the cultural norms, but also because of implicit discrimination against them. And implicit doesn't make it any less important. Why? What do I mean by implicit? It's the fact, it's the gendered share of unemployment rate and labor force participation, the fact that women are less represented in managerial positions, that they are overrepresented in informal labor and in all forms of care work, be it paid or unpaid, and in the paid where they are at the bottom of the employment pyramids. and that they are overrepresented in migrant domestic work as refugees, intersecting with other forms of vulnerabilities as well, and their involvement in non-standard digital work, especially in the aftermath of COVID-19. So this entails their exclusion naturally from social protection, but it entails their susceptibility to social protection, to the lack of social protection, minimum income security and universal health coverage, which is basically endogenous. This is to say that building universal social protection systems that are inclusive, effective, sustainable, integrated, shock responsive will naturally make them better off. But if I am to speak about women more, so building these systems is more than enough, is enough on its own. But to make social protection policies and social policies more gender responsive, I think it is worth highlighting that women will benefit from universal health coverage. They will benefit from minimum social security guarantees like elderly grants, disability grants, unemployment benefits, as well as from insurance and pension. But they would also benefit from social protection tools that are particularly gender specific or gender sensitive, like maternity benefits, like children grants, given that, for example, studies have shown that they are more likely to increase their families' welfare if they receive any form of income transfer, including informal workers and refugees in social protection systems, particularly, and moving away from pure employment-based social protection and from pure contributory schemes will also be of particular help to women, because it will help include women in care, women who are unemployed, and also who are in the informal labor, which are very gendered space. On the integration, I think—
Sorry, Shahra.
I can stop here. Yeah, because
I'm afraid, yes, we need to finish.
Very sorry.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Over now to our colleague Hashim Zaidi, who will give us some closing remarks as co-chair of the Regional Issue-Based Coalition on Social Protection. Over to you, Hashim.
Yeah, thanks, Marialaura. And I'm conscious of time, so I'll be fairly quick. First of all, congratulations to the ILO. I think for the report itself, it definitely is a much needed piece, given the data limitations that we have, not just in the region but across the globe on social protection. So I think it adds to the rich literature that exists out there. And thanks for extending the invite for this. I think a couple of things. First up, and this is just to highlight that, especially being from UNICEF, I think one thing that didn't come through the discussion, but Luca alluded to it, I think children continue to bear, the brunt of a lot of challenges that we face in this region. And I think the report also talks about child poverty in particular. And if we look at the figures globally, it's 333 million children who are still living in households, who have extreme poverty levels. And a significant proportion of those children reside in our region. Now, when we look at our region, particularly the fragile and the conflict nature of a lot of countries that are going through, it obviously compounds the problems that children in particular face. This is why the criticality of social protection continues to be a key, mechanism through which they could cope through these challenges. But anyway, I won't talk about, the current state, because a lot of colleagues and panelists have already added to this. But looking forward in terms of, there is definitely optimism as we look towards the future. I think Luca alluded to this as well, that we need to continue to build on the ministerial declaration on social protection from 2021. How do we continue to push countries, particularly in the Arab region, to expand social protection coverage and spending? This continues to be a key priority, for the IBC coalition. And how do we build on this? I think the second thing is, and this we see increasingly in the region, where there's a lot of investment going into strengthening national social protection systems, including work on, social protection policies and reforms. We've seen work done in Lebanon, in Iraq, and now increasingly working in Yemen on this. We see a lot of capacity building initiatives where investments are going into building capacity of national counterparts through initiatives like Transform, and then, making better investments into information systems, which tend to be the backbone of a lot of social protection architecture that exists in countries. And I think we also need to be, proud of how there have been successes where particularly like countries like Tunisia and Oman have introduced the universal child benefit, which is a massive achievement when we look at how things were maybe 5 years ago. And then, colleagues referred to Morocco as well. Just a couple of things to conclude, and I think these are areas and reflections in terms of areas that we need to continue to work on, and particularly given the focus on climate for the for the World Social Protection Report. I think one area that the region definitely lags on is how do we reflect the social protection agenda more effectively within key climate policy commitments, and this includes the NDCs, the national action plans. All of that continues to be an area where I think we are lagging behind as a region. And then the other one is something that Ugo was speaking to. Given the fragile nature of a lot of countries in the region, how do we continue to work on building better linkages between humanitarian responses and national social protection systems? In a region which is, facing multiple crises, this continues to be a key priority so that we can ensure that even short-term humanitarian assistance, which will get phased out eventually, is leaving behind strengthened national and local social protection institutions and systems. And I think that's something that continues to be a key, priority for the region. And for the IBC, I think these are things that we continue to look on and continue to discuss in terms of how can we better not just coordinate between humanitarian responses to linkages to national social protection systems, but also how does all the interventions contribute towards building a more inclusive, social protection system. I see your message, and let me stop here. So thanks again. Thanks, and back to you.
Thank you so much, Ashim, for your patience and for keeping it very short and effective. Colleagues, we have come to the end of this last session. This is, in fact, the last session of the Arab Social Protection Compass series. And we would like to thank everyone who have made this possible, starting from our colleagues at ISA, International Social Security Association. I apologize that it wasn't possible to have two full rounds of questions due to lack of time. We hope there will be other opportunities to continue the conversation in 2025. Make sure for those who are listening to answer our survey that will be distributed by email. And we hope that you will be able to continue follow this journey. I would like to thank again all our panelists for their very pointed, clear answers, and also for answering the Q&A questions. Thank you again, and see you soon.